If you have a Bible, or you can follow along on the screen, we're going to be going back into the Old Testament, deep into the Old Testament, to the book of 1 Kings. This morning I'm starting a new series of sermons that will take us, tell us the story of one of history's greatest prophets of God, the prophet Elijah, if you hadn't already guessed that from the screen, the prophet Elijah. Now, to actually take his life story would take many more Sundays than I've got to commit to this series. So instead of doing his entire life story, we're going to focus over the next few weeks on some select moments, some highlights of his life, some highlights of his story, and talk about some insightful and powerful biblical truths that really haven't changed. Even though these happened thousands of years ago, the central truth of what Elijah dealt with in his age hasn't changed, and the truths that remain ever current and relevant for us today. Now, this morning, for the purposes of getting started in this series, I want to kind of set the stage and give us a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the first point of Elijah's situation and the difficulties that he faced during his time of prophecy. This happens, 1 King chapter 17 is kind of our launch pad for this series. It happens during the time of the kings of Israel. Remember early on when the children of Israel were released from the captivity of Egypt, and God was their king. God was their guider. He was their provider. But there came the time that the people said, we want to be like other nations, and so we want a king, some human king rather than God. And so God gave them a king. He gave them King Saul, who was followed by King David, and who was followed by King Solomon. Elijah comes on the scene during the time of the 6th king of Israel, a king that really doesn't bear that much remembrance when we talk about the kings of Israel. This was King Ahab. Ahab ruled Israel from Samaria, which was the capital city then, not Jerusalem, but he ruled as king of Israel for 22 years. Ahab, even though we in the life of the church we don't really remember him very much, most of us who've been around the church very long, and a lot of people even outside the church, will recognize his wife's name. Ahab married a woman named Jezebel. Now that name usually rings a little more. Jezebel was a very vile and evil woman, a harlot, and she became the queen with King Ahab. The thing about Jezebel is that she had no roots in Hebrew history. She was of another nationality. She was the daughter of another king, and she was a devout worshiper of the god of Baal. B-A-A-L, Baal. Okay. Ever since the death of Solomon, under these following kings, idolatry had begun to come in like a flood in Israel. Other prophets that we read in the Old Testament, prophets Hosea, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, had all declared God's coming judgment on Israel because they had begun to follow idols. The idol worship had reached its peak when Ahab and Jezebel ascended to the throne, promoting Baal as the official god of Israel. In chapter 16 of 1 Kings, it gives us a picture of how the culture under Ahab and Jezebel had changed. This, chapter 16, verses 30 through 33, it says, "And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him." Wow, what a legacy. More than anyone before him, more than any of the other 5 kings of Israel, he did evil more than them. And as if it had not been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. It's kind of a jab there, a little bit of sarcasm. It says in other words, if it wasn't bad enough that he followed Jeroboam, the king Jeroboam, in his sinful ways, he took it even farther and went outside of the people of Israel and married this evil woman Jezebel, who worshipped Baal, and then Ahab began to worship Baal along with his wife Jezebel. Verse 33 says, Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord and God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So here's the scene. Evil times cover the whole land. Queen Jezebel supported the prophets of Baal. The idols and the temples were erected everywhere. So all over the kingdom of Israel were these idols and the statues, the Asherah trees, that were prominent all over the city and all over the nation of Israel. All of the citizens of Israel were expected to worship these idols instead of the one true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one that Moses had declared. Those who were the worshipers of the one true God were persecuted, were often burned to death or killed by the sword. At this point, in chapter 17, Elijah enters the stage of history. We don't know anything about Elijah's history. All we know is he was a Tishbite from the land of Tishbe. But he comes on the scene as an adult prophet of God. He drops in as if from heaven almost. He just kind of shows up and starts to work. He comes to them in chapter 17, verse 1, with the prophecy of God, and he goes directly to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. 17:1. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except at my word." This is not necessarily a prophecy of coming judgment, but a prophecy that says it's time. The other prophets, Jeremiah and Hosea and Isaiah, had prophesied there would come a time. Now Elijah is on the scene saying the time's up. It's going to happen. From this moment on, no dew, no rain. Now that seems rather odd. Why would God use this particular, why would he cut off the rain? And there's really 2 reasons why he would do that. First of all, in this particular area in Israel was a very productive agricultural land. The soil was good, and you could grow lots of crops. And the seasons and the climates was good. And Baal worshipers believed that Baal controlled the rain which brought fertility to the land. Baal was thought to be the storm god, the god of the weather, and the god of the rain. And so by stopping the rain, God was saying, listen, let me show you who's really in charge of the universe. You may be worshiping this Baal. You may think he controls the rain, but I'm going to shut off the spigot. I'm going to stop the rain because you think this other God controls the rain. I'm going to show you who's really in charge. But secondly, this discipline of God really should not have come as a surprise because the people had been warned beforehand. It's amazing. Elijah's declaration was the fulfillment of a prophecy that Moses had made years before and given to the people. They had heard it. They were warned. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 16 and 17, God speaks through Moses and tells the people, "Take care lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them." In other words, he's saying, take care, be careful. Don't let this happen to you that you begin to worship other gods. Verse 17, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you. And what's he going to do? He will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain. And the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you. This prophecy, Moses is saying you're going to a good land, a land that he had described as flowing with milk and honey, a land of prosperity, a land where the sheep could graze and never get hungry, a place where the crops would grow. They described grapes as big as cantaloupes, if you will, and just wonderful crops in this place. But God had said, if you turn to idols, if you start to worship any other gods, then I'm going to cut off the rain. And the grapes won't grow. And the fig trees will not blossom. And there will be no grass for the sheep to graze. This was a prophecy that all of Israel should have known. Even Ahab should have known this. But he refused to believe God and followed after the idols of Baal anyway. Elijah spoke the word, and from that moment on, in a way very reminiscent to God's dealings with the Egyptians, God used the forces of nature to humble the entire idolatrous kingdom of Israel. No dew, no rain fell on the earth for 3 years, the Bible tells us. Can you imagine? Our canals are low right now. We're facing a water shortage in Cape Coral right now, but I cannot fathom what it would be like to anticipate no rainy season for 3 years. But for 3 years, the land began to crust over. The drought was so intense that the land dried up, the plants and the trees withered and died. The animals were dying from a lack of food and water, and people suffered from not having good, clean, drinkable water. Now, Scripture tells us that God made some heavenly provision for Elijah himself. It says again in chapter 17 that the word of the Lord came to Elijah, and told him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan, and you shall drink from the brook. And I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. History tells us that Elijah stayed by that brook in solitude and in prayer for a little more than a year before God would move him to another place for 2 more years until the end of the drought. Now, I read that text and mention that because I want you to catch that. I want you to remember that. The 1 year of solitude by the brook, because that's going to become very important as we look at a couple of other key moments in Elijah's life here in a few weeks. So that's the setting, that's the background that we have for the beginning of the story of Elijah. Now, I want us to think for a few minutes this morning what in the world that has to say to us today. What in the world's that got to do with anything we're going through today. I believe it's telling us that God takes idol worship very seriously. Elijah's prophecy, Moses' prophecy, harkens back to the very first of the commandments of God. Thou shalt have no other God before me. God repeatedly tried to teach this to the people of Israel. Elijah reminded Ahab, the Lord Jehovah is the God of Israel, not Baal. He is a living God, and not like the gods of Baal that were dead and dumb idols with no power. His rebuke was coming in a way that was impossible for their idols to do anything about. By withholding the rain, God would prove Baal's impotency and the folly of those who had left the true and the living God. Today still, one of the biggest deceits the enemy of our soul has used and still uses is to deceive God's people into placing something else in God's place. In other words, an idol. Now, if we're honest, as I was looking and praying and studying through these passages of Scripture, the idolatry is a topic which many modern Christians think is outdated. You know, we hear the word idol today and we either think of a television show or we think of the Old Testament. We picture a golden statue of a bull or a calf. Or we tend to skim over the passages that include references to idolatry because we see it as something only Old Testament believers struggle with. But that's really not the case. It wasn't just Old Testament believers that struggled with idolatry. The reasons many of us aren't acknowledging the idols in our lives is primarily due to the fact that we have an incorrect definition and image of what an idol truly is. So let me explain it very simply. And idols are anything that takes God's place in giving us fulfillment, satisfaction, security, or significance in our lives. Many of the things people have idolized, both past and present, are not necessarily bad things, but good things that take bad positions in our priorities. Idolatry is the hidden sin driving all other sins. The major sin in our lives evidence a deeper issue than just the symptoms of sin that we see externally manifested. They point to something which we do not believe about God at our core, that really God can't bring me the fulfillment that I need, that God can't bring me the satisfaction, the security, the significance that I need in my life. We value something else, something other than God, to fill that void in our life. The sobering fact is, we actually believe the lie that whatever our sinful selves lust after is better than Jesus. So we've got to be aware of how idols come in various forms. We see them as disgraceful, evil passions. It's important to recognize idols can also be good things that we have made ultimate things. I hope you catch that. Idols can be good things that we have prioritized as ultimate things. A few examples that we put our value and confidence in. It might be our children or our spouse, our physical appearance, our job, even our friendships. When people look to money or the comforts of life to fill a space that they just cannot fill. None of these things are inherently evil in themselves, but they become a problem when we begin to believe that they satisfy us more than God can. When we find greater delight in our hobbies than in our walk with Christ, we are wandering down the path of idolatry. When we spend more time absorbing the entertainment and the pleasures of the world than we do contemplating godly truth, we are toying with idolatry. When any possession dominates our thoughts and captures our affection more than the treasure of Christ, it is likely that that thing has become an idol. When we find excessive delight in a relationship with some other person to the neglect of our relationship with Christ, that other person can become an idol. And you might not think about it. It's something that in the ministry, even ministry, can become an idol. When we find more delight in serving Christ than in seeking Christ. It's a problem we as pastors and ministers have to, we get so busy doing church work that we fail to do the work of the church. When we are more delighted in serving Christ than seeking Christ, than being with Christ, it becomes an idol. One commentator said, I would neither have you be idle in duties nor make idols of your duties. When we find greater confidence in our own strength and capabilities than in humble reliance on Jesus Christ, we can easily fall under the spell of idolatry and self-worship. Selfishness is idolatry when we put ourselves above the cause of Christ. Israel's idol worship led to the physical drought. But I want you to remember that before the physical drought came the spiritual drought. A dry time in Israel spiritually as they wandered down the path to idolatry, as they decided, made decisions, this little bit won't hurt. Their faith in God dried up when they allowed idols to take God's place. Idol worship today continues to dry up faith, even the faith of once faithful believers. So we've got to go back. We've got to listen afresh to the words of Moses. Take care. Take care lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside to other gods and worship them. So we've got to survey our life and survey it often. Because idolatry is a subtle sin. No one just decides this morning, I'm going to start putting other priorities higher than God. It's a subtle sin. It's a sneaky sin. It begins in incremental decisions, incremental parts. So it's important for everyone, those who are followers of Jesus and those who are not, to take an account of their lives, to survey our life and survey it often, to give Jesus his rightful place in our heart and life. And if we find that we are in that dry time, the drought has come, then we must remember that Jesus said that he is the living water. And we can run to him. He is the only one who can satisfy the thirsty soul. This is God's word for today. You think about that, okay?
Hi, this is Pastor Don from Watershed Church here in Cape Coral, Florida. Thank you for stopping by our YouTube channel to listen in to our Sunday morning preaching services. If you want more information about us, I invite you to check out our webpage at mywatersedgechurch.com, or you can check our Facebook page. Just search for Waters Edge Church, Cape Coral, Florida. Or better yet, I would love to meet you in person. We gather every Sunday morning at 10:30 for a time of inspirational worship and biblically based preaching. We would love to meet you, and we've got a seat here reserved just for you. Hope to see you soon. God bless.